great to see you here in this building, or if you're joining us online, or if you're watching a bit later or listening a bit later, it's great to have you join us. We are in the second week of our series called Stand. And you're all sitting down. But we called it Stand. And in this series, we are going to take, well, we have taken one, we're going to take three more. We're going to take 4 stories in total from the book of Daniel, the Old Testament book of Daniel. This is the guy who brought to you the stories of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego being thrown into the fiery furnace, although we skipped that story. This is the guy who will, next week, we'll talk about being thrown into a lion's den. And the book doesn't end there, so that's an interesting story to come in here. But in the first week, which wasn't last week because we were all out door knocking, the week before that, Sarah gave us a message, and it was called Standing Out, and it really set us up. So I wanted to encourage you to go to the website. If you weren't here, go to the website and catch up on that one. I think here it is. So this is our website for those of you who don't do this thing. So this is our internet, and if you click on that Stand Daniel thing, it will take you to the playlist of all the Daniel sermons on YouTube. And of course, there's only one so far, and tomorrow there'll be another one. And so catch up, keep up, and read along at home. Today we are in Daniel chapter 4. So if you would like to at home read along, you probably need to read chapters 1 through 4, and then 5 and 6, because next week we're in Daniel chapter 6. So there you go, there's some homework for you. But Sarah brought to us a message about standing out. And it talked about the importance in our culture, particularly as Christians in our culture, where we are no longer the dominant cultural group in Australia. We call ourselves a Christian country, or some do. And we have all the words, but many of the values and the subtext of our culture is not, in fact, Christian. So we are a minority in our culture. So it's important sometimes to stand out. And we talked about in Daniel chapter 1, we learned that it was important to stand out for the right things at the right time and in the right way. And that's important. So if you missed that message, or you don't remember what that was about, I encourage you to go back and take a look, because that's an important one for us in our culture. So this week, though, we are going to continue in this theme, and we're going to talk about standing up for what is right. Talking about standing up for what is right. This is not about political activism. This is not about protesting and joining the marches and so on. This is about the one-on-one conversations you have with people where you need to stand up for what's right. And you need to have that tough conversation and the difficult conversation. Standing up for what's right. And this is a tough message. It's a tough one for me to preach. Because I know out there, among you and those in the YouTube's worlds, there are some people who might hear this message the wrong way. There are some people out there who are, well, quite confrontational by nature. Do you know these sorts of people? And when you preach a message about standing up for what's right, it's like handing them a loaded gun. And so I want to be very careful about the way we do this. So I want to begin with a bit of a show of hands so we know who we're talking about. Who do I need to be very clear? No. I want to do this. All right, show of hands. Who among you would consider yourself to be a confrontational sort of person? Right? Who would be the person, if you were at McDonald's on a Wednesday night after band practice and someone had given you from the counter a burger that didn't have the bacon on it that you asked for, who would be the person that you would send back, or who would be the first one to volunteer to take that burger back? I wasn't going to name Joe, but there you go. Who else, like Joe, would be quite happy to take the burger back and say something? Yeah? Alison? Come on, everyone show of hands at once. Come on, we're the confrontational type. Come on, we do the hands. We're good. Now, who among you is non-confrontational? For instance, if you went to a coffee shop, this is a coffee shop you go to all the time, and you have a good relationship with the barista and so on, and this one time they made you a coffee that was just bitter, and it was sour, and you didn't like it at all. Who would be the person who would not take that coffee back? I was going to dob in Rebecca before you all put your hands up, but that's okay. There's so many coffee shops now in Wollongong that we don't go to because one time, one barista made a bad coffee, and instead of taking it back to the barista and saying, look, I think there's something wrong with your machine or your temperature sensors or just your ability to make coffee that you need to fix. So we don't do that. We just don't go there ever again. And the relationship is severed. And then there are a bunch of you, of course, in that exercise who did not put your hands up at all, and you are the super passive, who did not want to be at all involved in any sort of conflict. So we have a range of people in various ways of doing things. But we need to be careful, and we need to stand up sometimes. Social media is a place that we need to mention up here up front of our message today, because social media is a platform for you to share your opinions and ideas, but also it's a place where you get to comment on other people's opinions, ideas, and statuses. And I know different social media platforms are better or worse at this than others. Twitter is by far the worst, but there are people out there who don't know you, who don't know the context of what you're talking about, who don't really know your situations in life, and they just love to correct you, don't they? Have you ever had that? Maybe you don't post anything slightly controversial on Facebook, but there are those people who they just live with it. They believe it's their God-given right to correct you, even though they don't know you. So we need to be very careful, and we're going to learn about standing up for what's right. So we look at Daniel in chapter 4 of the book of Daniel, confronting King Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar, if you want to say it the right way. And we're going to see if there's anything to be learned from this encounter that we can apply to Twitter, which is interesting, 2,500 years later. How do we confront in the right way, the right time, for the right reasons? Because there will be those times where you are called to intervene in somebody's life because a friend of yours, someone you love, starts to make really stupid decisions. Have you ever had that experience? A friend of yours growing up and they just, like, what are you doing? Or what about if you're a parent? Sometimes you have a child that makes some pretty bad decisions. I mean, one of them might want a cat one day. I mean, that's really... You need to have a chat. No, seriously though, you might have a child that's making bad decisions. And you need to know the right way. Not to push them away, but to bring them back and to say the right things. Or you might have a family member who's making really dumb financial decisions, some uncle, auntie, cousin, niece, whatever. And they start racking up debt on their credit card and you're like, I've got to say something. I've got to help them out. They're destroying themselves for the rest of their life. They're setting themselves up for failure and you've got to say something. How do you do that? Maybe your best friend growing up, your accountability partner almost. They start to make really bad relationship decisions. We were talking to young people this week, talking about growing up in the church, and so often our friends in growing up become young adults. They finish university, they move away, and they start to make really bad decisions. And you're like, what are you doing? How do you talk to them about that? How do you challenge them? How do you say, look, how do we do that? And we look at Daniel and see that. Maybe you have a relative who is a total judgmental pain in the butt. Anyone got one of those relatives? A particular auntie or uncle who is just so critical. I mean, every family's got one, surely. If you're sitting there thinking, my family doesn't have one, well, perhaps ask your family and make sure it's not you. But it seems like every family has someone who's totally judgmental, and you need to know how to say, look, this Christmas time when they come around, or you go to their place, or they're there, and they just start paying out on you or your kids or someone else, and you just have to, how do you do that? How do you have that conversation? So we are in Daniel chapter 4, learning what we can say, how we say it. King Nebuchadnezzar. Nebuchadnezzar is an evil, self-obsessed tyrant. He is particularly difficult. He was the one who conquers Jerusalem and picks up all the wealthy young people from Jerusalem and the older people and anyone skilled and qualified and ships them all across the desert to Babylon to serve as servants. And as we learned in chapter 1, Daniel was one of these. He was about 15 years old. They are forced into this new Babylonian culture to which they must serve. And Daniel particularly was trained to enter the king's service with 3 friends, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that we talked about. And Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego find themselves in a bind where the king has almost tied his own hands and he's forced to throw them into a fiery furnace. King Nebuchadnezzar's a nice guy. No. He throws them into the fiery furnace. And you know what's interesting about this chapter? Is that it's written by Nebuchadnezzar. This is the Holy Bible, the Holy Scriptures, written by one of the most evil kings in the world. Isn't that interesting? No? I think it's interesting. It reads like his diary entry. Go read it. Read all of chapter 4. And you'll find sections of it are in the voice of King Nebuchadnezzar. Anyhow, that's kind of a side note. I thought that was interesting. And did you know that Saddam Hussein considers Nebuchadnezzar his idol, or did, one of his idols? That was the king that he wished to emulate as a tyrant. So it's an interesting character. King Nebuchadnezzar, not a good guy. So earlier in the book of Daniel, I think chapter 2, if you were reading along at home, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego find themselves on the wrong side of the king, and the king has to throw them into a fiery furnace, which he does. But he looks into the fiery furnace, and there's 4 people in there. He's like, I can count. There was 3, now there's 4. What's going on? And they're unharmed. It's like putting someone into a cremator and them coming out unharmed. It doesn't make any sense. It was really hot for firing bricks. So he pulls them out and he says, what's going on? And they say, there's God of Israel. And of course, King Nebuchadnezzar, being a polytheist, believes in many gods, one of them being himself. He loves this and he pays respect to God, the God we know and love. But he carries on himself, worshipping his gods and his other gods, even though he finds respect for the God of Israel. So, an evil King Nebuchadnezzar has a dream in chapter 4, and he's really, really troubled by this dream. It is insanely vivid, and it keeps him from sleeping. He can't get it out of his mind. He doesn't know what it means, and he calls in the magicians, the interpreters, the oracles, the sages to find out what it meant. Have you ever had a dream like that? Well, not with a tree and stuff, but have you ever had a dream that's so vivid, and you wake up the next morning and you're still angry at your wife for whatever she said to you in the dream? No? You never had a dream like that? I have. Anyway, he goes to and the oracles and the sages say, we can't interpret the dream, which is interesting though, because in other versions of the Bible it says, we won't interpret the dream. Isn't that interesting? Because you see what would happen is these oracles and sages, they would interpret the dream, and it's not a difficult dream to understand. It's smarter than a 5th grader. You can figure it out, right? In fact, within the dream, the watchman from heaven explains what's going on. But they do not want to tell the king because the king is most likely to fly into a rage and shoot the messenger. They're afraid. Did I mention he's an evil king? So they're afraid. So they say, we can't do this. And the king says, well, what do you want me to do? They palm the responsibility off to Daniel. Daniel's a servant. He's disposable. And they didn't like him all that much anyway. Because earlier in the book, Daniel had interpreted a dream for the king, and the oracles could not. So they palm the responsibility off to Daniel. Daniel, at this point, is about 45 years old. In chapter 1, he's about 15 years old. And during the middle, we have the Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego story. We have another interpretation of a dream story. Daniel and the king have a relationship. They know each other. Daniel is respected by the king. And as we found out, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God we worship, Nebuchadnezzar also respected, if perhaps not worshipped. So Daniel is brought before the king, and the king tells Daniel the dream, which we read earlier, about this great tree, successful and prosperous, until the holy watchman, interesting idea, a holy watchman, whatever that is, comes down from heaven with instructions to cut down the tree, leaving a stump that will sit there for 7 seasons with in the dew and surrounded by feeding animals. And then the watchman says, so that everyone living will know that the high God rules human kingdoms. He arranges kingdom affairs however he wishes, and he makes leaders out of losers. I love that phrase. He makes leaders out of losers. Hallelujah. So, Daniel is afraid. He's not silly. He's like the oracles and the sages. He knows what this is about. He knows this is, he says, at first, Daniel, who had been renamed Belshazzar in Babylon, was upset. The thoughts that came swarming into his mind terrified him. Belshazzar, the king said, "Stay calm. Don't let this dream and its interpretation scare you." "My master," says Belshazzar, "I wish this dream were about your enemies and its interpretation for your foes." Utter humility, my master. Well, Daniel eventually gives this explanation of the dream. "It means that the high God has sentenced my master the king. You will be driven away from human company and live with the wild animals. You will graze on grass like an ox. You will be soaked." I thought that was going to go away. It didn't. "You will be soaked in heaven's dew. This will go on for 7 seasons. And you will learn that the high God rules over human kingdoms." I shouldn't have said dew after that, should I? "And he arranges kingdom affairs." The part about the tree stump and the roots being left means that your kingdom will stand there for you after you learn that it is heaven that runs things. Now, that's a pretty tough message to have to give, but he doesn't stop there. He doesn't stop there. He really stands up and he says this: "So, king, take my advice, make a clean break with your sins and start living for others. Quit your wicked life and look after the needs of the down and out. Then you will continue to have a good life." He didn't need to say that. He was asked for an interpretation, but he stood up and gave an editorial, a sermon, on top of the interpretation. That's pretty hardcore. That takes a lot of courage to point out that the king was wicked. Did I mention he's not a nice king? To call the king selfish, tell him that he needs to start living for others. Well, fortunately, the book of Daniel doesn't end here, which you might think it did. It doesn't end here. Nebuchadnezzar doesn't kill Daniel. So Daniel managed to stand up, say what needed to be said. How do we do that? How do we stand up and say what needs to be said? Well, I want to turn, if you have your scriptures there, I want to turn to the book of Galatians, where Paul writes to a church just like ours, except a bit older, and he talks and he gives these instructions for dealing with this kind of thing. Galatians 6, 1-3 says, "Live creatively, friends. If someone falls into sin, forgivingly restore him, saving your critical comments for yourself. You might need forgiveness before the day's out. Stoop down and reach out to those who are oppressed. Share their burdens and so complete Christ's law." I'd love to do that. We should preach on this one week. If you think you're too good for that, you're badly deceived. Snap. So here are 2 things we need to remember from Daniel's experience, from Paul's teaching in our everyday lives. The first thing is to make sure that we stand up, we confront somebody with the goal of restoration, with the goal of bringing them back onto a right path. Now, here's something Craig Rochelle said that I thought was absolutely brilliant. And if you have a pen and paper, or if you just got a pen, write it on your hand, write it on your forehead so you see it in the mirror, write it anywhere, write it everywhere. Here's this: we never confront someone because we are right. We only confront someone because we want them to be all right. Does that make sense? We never confront someone because we are right. We only confront someone because we want them to be all right. Gently and humbly. It writes in Galatians 6 verse 1, I have a couple of translations here, forgivingly restore them. Restore them gently. In another translation it says humbly and gently. Restore them. Because this is the other thing. Unless you have a good relationship with somebody, They will never feel like you're there to help them. Restoration only works in the context of a good relationship. I can tell you, if my wife is going to talk to me about the way I pack the dishwasher, she can't do it just after we've been arguing about how to pack the washing machine. Does anyone relate to that? Your friend is not going to be able to tell you something you need to hear unless you are in a good relationship with them. What does Daniel do? My master, I wish this dream were about your enemies and an interpretation for your foes. He is humble and he is gentle. He doesn't just lay it out. He says, look, I wish it wasn't this way, but. I want to say life groups are key to this, to our continued growth and development as spiritual and emotional beings. We often develop blind spots, fall into traps, fall into ruts, get busy. We trip, we fall in different areas of our lives. We need a bunch of people who love us, who we can be vulnerable with, who can be confidential, who we can rely on to help us get back up again. We need a bunch of people who can help us pray, who can show us when we get off track. If this Christianity thing was only about going to church whenever you can on a Sunday morning, then you're not going to get very far. Sorry, that's just the way it is. You're not going to see the changes in your life that you might hope for. It's only when you're truly willing to share your life, to be vulnerable and open with other good friends, that you will see growth and progress. This is how we learn how to be married, how we learn to parent, how we learn to grandparent. It's how we learn to deal with difficult employers or difficult staff. It's when we learn how to deal with alcohol and other addictions, whether in us or in members of our family. It's there in our small groups where we wrestle with grief and loss. That's where we truly get into the deeper things. That's where we can be confronted and restored. And secondly, it's important to stand up with caution. To stand up with caution. Live creatively, friends. If someone falls into sin, forgivingly restore him. Saving your critical comments for yourself. You might be needing forgiveness before the day's out. If you're concerned about an issue that you see in someone else, you need to be very, very careful. Take stock, because sometimes it can be that God has placed a burden on your heart for that issue. And that's great. But sometimes it reflects a weakness in your own heart. We used to be at Palm Core offices up on the Central Coast, and attached to the Central Coast core, sort of attached, semi-detached, was a drug and alcohol recovery facility. 100 guys, generally, in this place, and tell you what, it was the most amazing place. It was truly a place of miracles. And after they finished programs, so many of them got attached to the church, joined soccer teams, joined music teams, whatever else. They got involved and they wanted to stay. And so there was, from time to time, they established share houses. They'd rent a house and a bunch of guys that lived together. It was great. One day a guy came to me and he said, "You've got to kick this guy out of my house." And I'm like, "Not my house. What am I going to do about it?" But anyway, he came to me and he said, I walked past his room and there on his laptop was pornography. And I just can't stand it. It's really doing my head in. My sobriety is being affected. This guy is going to bring me undone. You've got to get him out of the house. The stuff is filthy. It's awful. And I'm like, well, I agree with you, but you're overreacting a little bit. I didn't say that to him. Have you ever said that to somebody and gotten a good result? No. But I remember thinking to myself, well, that's true, but he seems to be overreacting a little bit. Overly, confrontational. I hate to think what he said to the guy in the house, but turns out, about a month later, we discovered that he was in a relationship with a married woman. You see? And it's not just those big sort of things. Sometimes you find people that'll come to you and they'll complain about gossip. And in doing so, tell you everybody's life story. It's kind of funny. and yet sad. So sometimes you can be concerned about an issue that you see in someone else. You have to be very, very careful. Because sometimes it can be God that's placed a burden on your heart, but sometimes it can reflect a weakness in you. We need to be very careful. And of course, if we ever get involved like this, if I ever bring loving correction to you, if I ever sit down and we have a chat, I am not higher than you. In the same thing, if you come to me with some loving correction, you're not higher than me. We are both, or all of us, lower than God. And we are all just trying to do better. When we realize that we are lower to God, then that's when we can do things for the right reasons, in the right way, and at the right time. Because the last thing I want to see is our church full of people who are against each other, who are anxiously looking for things to be corrected in each other. So many churches fall into those patterns of behavior. They become really well known for what they're against. Do you know that? Have you noticed? Have you seen so often in our society that churches are known for what they are against rather than what they're for? Do you know that? Anyone nodding in recognition? As the Salvation Army, we are for people. We are for others. We are all about people finding freedom from the things that can crush the human spirit. You need to hear me. We're not looking to correct others. We're looking to help. And we're looking to help people find God. This is what David says to the king. A king he has a long relationship with. A king who has respect for David, who he cares about. For Daniel, sorry. Daniel says to the king, I wish this wasn't about you. Well, first he acknowledges the king as his master. He puts himself on a lower plane. He says, I wish this wasn't about you. I wish this was about your enemies, but it's not. It's about you. He explains the dream. He gives his sermon about how the king needs to turn more to the ways of God. The king comes forward. He kneels at the place of prayer. The band starts to play All That I Am, and he gives his heart to God, and everyone lives happily ever after. Except not. The king doesn't. He continues to rebel against God. He continues to mistreat people. He continues to live in ways that are not godly ways. And he falls into 7 horrible years of insanity, grounded in his own self-obsession and selfishness. The moral of the story is you're not responsible for the response. You're only responsible to lovingly and humbly say what you think God is calling you to say and do, and then to trust God with the outcome. Because in the end, after the 7 years of insanity interpreted by Daniel, Nebuchadnezzar writes, Now I, Nebuchadnezzar, praise and exalt and glorify the King of heaven, because everything he does is right and all his ways are just, and those who walk in pride he is able to humble. It took 7 horrible years, but he came back to a worshipful stance before God. I don't know what you face. I don't know what conversations you've had. I don't know what your family is like. But I do know we all need prayer. We all need to take a moment this morning to ask God, how do you want us to speak? What do you want us to say? And at what time do you want us to say it? How do we have those conversations with friends who've walked away? With children who make bad choices? With friends who make bad relationship choices? We're going to sing that song again that we just sung. What can wash away my sin? Nothing but the blood of Jesus. What can make me whole again? Nothing but the blood of Jesus.